I would like to provide this opportunity to our distinguished panelists today. I would like to introduce them first. We have with us Dr. Shubhra Chaturvedi, Visiting Fellow at NIICE. We're also joined by Dr. Bishnu Upreti, Executive Director of Policy Research Institute. This panel is also joined by Professor Dr. Mohan Lohani, former President of Nepal Council of World Affairs. We're also joined by Mr. Kosh Koirala, Associate Editor at Republica. And we're also joined by Ms. Namrata Sharma, Advisor at Center for Investigative Journalism. So before we actually start with the presentations, I'm requesting for a few rules for this panel to accomplish on time. I'm suggesting all our panelists to present their inaugural remarks, opening remarks on the role of think tank on their part, who are representing actually the think tanks. I trust three of our panelists today would speak on the role of think tank, and two of our panelists would highlight on the role of media. So first 10 minutes for each panelist on the role, the exploration of these notions into how the making of Nepal's foreign policy could be explored and contributed on part of both think tanks and media. Then maybe we will have a few questions in between. That would be the end of about 50 minutes. Plus, if we have some questions, we would entertain them. Then in the second stage, second part of this discussion, I would like to seek some insights from our distinguished panelists on how both think tanks and media could actually contribute towards making of Nepal's foreign policy. So without further delay, I would like to start with a very general questions to all of our panelists. How does both think tank and media affect the structure of both national and international interactions among the nations in making of Nepal's foreign policy? And I would like to start from Dr. Shubhra Chaturvedi. Over to you, madam.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, NIICE, for this opportunity. And I'm going to respond to the Chair initially in kind of discussing the role of think tanks and media in the foreign policy. I'll actually start with a basic definition of foreign policy, which is primarily a country's strategy or a government strategy to interact with other states. While traditionally foreign policy was based on a system of defensive or offensive or balancing states, which were treated as black boxes, the evolving times have kind of highlighted the limitations of classical realism, and thus began the emergence of actors like the media, the think tanks, basically the non-state actors, which it was realized had much more impact in several ways. This kind of led to a transition of foreign policy analysis from being just a subdiscipline of international relations to becoming a branch of political science of kind of public policy. According to the US Department of State Archives, the first think tank in the world was the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, which was established in 1910. The aim at that time for a think tank was to kind of work on the causes of war, what could prevent it, and look at pacific settlement of international disputes, what could avoid another war. And then a second wave of think tanks was seen post-1945, when the Americans rose as the leaders of the free world, and they started contributing to a lot of institutions around the world, which were supported directly by the US government and the US state departments. But it did take a few years for that spirit to pass on to the South Asian region. There are many experts in think tanks as well as media houses who are focused on specific issues. It is not like earlier times when we just had space for generals. There are experts who are confined to different sort of stratas, who work on them, who do their research, who have a whole team following up the international events as they happen. And that results in the influencing as well as increasing awareness about the foreign policy decisions along the population. The development of the media sector, due to the immense progress of the channels of communications, have played an important role for the same. There is a sort of an overlap of the contribution of think tanks and media with portals. The think tanks kind of utilize these media portals to be heard better. That altogether impacts the public opinion or even the international opinion in several cases. While the think tanks have the academic credentials, the media houses facilitate the diffusion of knowledge through high-level contacts. And if used properly, this can actually lead to good awareness. From moral evaluation of decisions like American withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan, to economic issues like Bitcoin, to political issues like the South China Sea, there is a pool of expertise working and shaping expectations as well as perceptions through all these methods. There are articles, there are books being written, there are research papers, television interviews, op-eds, web pages. A lot of these are being channelized for diffusion of knowledge by these two sectors coming together. Nepal has been working in the same spirit where new ideas are being brought into the public domain through initiatives like the Think Tank Initiative, the Nepal Forum for International Journalists, the NIICE Foundation. The fields have covered a huge spectrum, but from a third eye perspective, from my perspective, I can see 4 specific goals in which they are contributing. The first is the generation of new ideas. The conceptions of national interests can be changed. Many political leaders bounce their ideas off these experts of epistemic communities, to test these new ideas. We heard in earlier sessions during this conclave about Nepal's soft power and its implications, or the concepts like human security, rational technological future in Nepal, and how democracy is kind of placed in them. These are all important relevant issues of Nepal's foreign policy. The second goal, I believe, is the training and promotion of experts. Beyond just assisting government officials, there is a whole pool of talent operating. These institutions are helping in keeping the outgoing officials engaged by using their experience to influence future policies. New initiatives are worked upon, and many foreign dignitaries actually use these platforms to access the influential segments. The third goal is the engagement of public. The media and the think tanks have best utilized the accelerated pace of globalization, whether it's the value of world peace, or the respect for territorial sovereignty, or the issue of national interest in foreign policy decisions. The organizations in Nepal continue to provide unbiased viewpoints, which are viewer and even reader friendly, as well as comprise of detailed opinions. The fourth and the most important goal, which for me has been the bridging of differences. All the avenues in Nepal have been visibly working towards facilitating dialogues and mediation processes. The track to dialogues are being tailor-made to address issues ranging from, say, like vaccine diplomacy to Nepal-Europe engagements. The unofficial initiatives, all of them, address sensitive issues and work as what Matthew Rodzinski would call in becoming eyes, ears, and even the conscience of the country, as well as the international community. Now, whether it's a bane or a boon, this is an evaluation reserved for everything with a brain. While it is true that think tanks and media houses aid transparent and open discussions, they are a tool of to sense the public as well as international mood. The limits are kind of blurred. In the name of democratic spirit, miscalculations can actually lead to a lot of problematic scenarios. There are, of course, institutions which are promoting selective ideologies and specific interests. And honestly, much like any other phenomena, this too has seen a lot of goof ups. For example, not very far away, just in a neighborhood, we had Datt, who was covering live Indian military exercises during the Kargil war. That still continues to be an issue raised. But that does not overshadow the contributions made by this sector to the huge history that we have. We can never overshadow Samuel Huntington's, which played such an important role in the American foreign policy, and we have the likes working in all the countries all over the world. I actually would like to agree with the description of think tanks and media houses as intellectual venture capitalists, which over time accumulate knowledge and serve as centers of expertise in the best way possible. And I look forward to hearing much more from everybody along these lines. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shubhra Chaturvedi, for opening up with many issues, highlighting the role of think tank and media. Next, to give you with some balanced remarks at the beginning, I would like to go with one of our panelists representing media, with Mr. Kosh Koirala. Mr. Koirala, do you think that, as Dr. Shubhra Chaturvedi highlighted, from long time, these platforms, both media and think tanks, have been providing space for unbiased viewpoint? What is your observation about the bridging differences and facilitating dialogue process relating to the making of Nepal's foreign policy? Over to you, Kosh. You're muted.
Let me unmute. Thank you. Thank you, Laxman sir. Dr. Shubhra has already highlighted many aspects of the media and the relation between media and think tank. And also she highlighted a bit about how media and think tank contribute to the making of foreign policy. The question about unbiased view and facilitating dialogue, that is the primary function of the media, and that sometimes has not happened for some obvious reason. But then, in general, this is exactly what media are doing. So let me tell you briefly about what kind of role media actually play in shaping foreign policy. So basically, foreign policy, one of the determinants of foreign policy is public opinion. Despite, we have different, determinants like geography to history to many other things. But important among them is public opinion. And this is where the role of media comes in. And the media actually builds public opinion. And accordingly, the policymakers, they are supposed to formulate policies. If they happen to formulate foreign policy, or let's say any other kind of policies that goes against the public opinion, then that is likely to cause boomerang that doesn't help to the policymakers. So this is exactly what is doing what media is doing even in our country. Government becomes sensitive towards the public opinion, and they when they formulate the laws. Sometimes media also kind of highlight the necessity or the needs of formulating new laws. You can see one of the important areas of concern of our foreign policy is this, let's say, migrant labors. the kind of issues that media often raise, that kind of forces government to come up with new policies and how to work in the interest of the migrant workers. For instance, that's just an example. So in similar case, like be it relation with other countries like India, China, because the relation of our country with other countries is largely dictated by the kind of public opinion that is that prevails in our country. So we can see like some sort of difficulties in our relation with India, and kind of not much difficulty that we can observe in our relation with China. So maybe it's also about like how media projects certain thing. So it is there. So what I mean to say is the media's role in making foreign policy is basically it builds public opinion, and accordingly policymakers they just formulate foreign policies to suit public, in accordance with the opinion of the public. And sometimes like there are issues which are not highlighted, which are not raised, media actually brings them to the public, and policymakers also come to know, and that also somehow helps to shape a country's foreign policy. In some cases, these days, this is the age of media, and media has become very, very influential in terms of determining foreign policy. And there's a term called CNN effect. It's because the power of media, how medias are shaping foreign policy. It's not just Nepal, it's everywhere. And if you look at the US, the scenario of the US, what CNN says, that continues to prevail in US foreign policy making. So that is there. So I'm just trying to underscore the importance of media in making foreign policy. And sometimes what happens is, if part of the foreign policy, the execution or the implementation of foreign policy is also kind of facilitated by media. Sometimes what happens is small countries like Nepal, maybe our bureaucrats, our foreign policy, the foreign ministry mechanism, they're sometimes not able to raise Nepal's genuine voices with maybe their neighbors or other countries. So in that case, when media actually raise those issues, and if they publish those issues regularly, then that somehow influences. We can see like sometime when there was like border dispute between Nepal and India, and the way media raised that issue, that became more effective than the note verbal that our country sent to Kathmandu, sent to New Delhi. So in that sense, it is very it has become very important, not just in shaping, but also in the implementation of the foreign policy, or helping government to meet its foreign policy goal. So it's called, in other words, it's called naming and shaming. Like because international system is anarchic, there's no global police and anything. So media has become one of the important tool to implement different foreign policy decision. So in international relation, we call it like naming and shaming. When somebody continues to name that particular country, those who have not implemented certain foreign policy decision, and if you just start shaming them in media regularly, then that somehow forces the policymaker of that country also to like think about in implementing that. So now coming back to the relation between media and think tank, I think we complement each other, right? Media and think tank, we complement each other. So think tank primarily they come up with evidence-based research. They come up with findings based on different researches. So it is the job of media to actually pick those findings, and then take them to the public, diffuse them. Basically, the responsibility of media is to diffuse the knowledge generated by a think tank. So if that happens, then I think we can better contribute to the foreign policy making. We can contribute to evidence-based foreign policy making. Somehow that has not happened. The part of the reason is we do not have many think tanks. There are think tanks, they have not actually been able to come up with, make research, a lot of resources that we need. And also there's like, even in our context, like we journalists are also not very, active in pursuing, those kind of things like research-based writing, because we are, generally we tend to just, talk to some people and he said, she said kind of journalism that we are continuing with. I think, on our part, like we need to improve that aspect. But again, when we talk about the relation between media and, think tank, I think we complement each other. And, we need to collaborate with each other. Like when, think tank bodies come up with some interesting finding, it is our responsibility to make them or take them to public so that public can make, informed decision about something. They can make their opinion based on, the concrete finding, evidence-based, findings. So that way, I think we are related to each other, and this is how, media actually play a role. And when it comes to the role of media in our country, I talked about in general, we do have certain lackings in our part. Like there's a tendency of, not to just, follow these resources and, base our reportings on those research findings. There's problem. I think there's some grounds for us to improve. I think I stop here. Maybe, when we have other questions, and I'll be back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Koirala, on shedding light about media's role for foreign policy, making of the foreign policy. You highlighted on some issues, how media provides platforms for opinion formulation and building. I will have a follow-up questions to you. I will also wait for our audience to put their questions in chat box, but maybe I will carry a few of my concerns to next speakers, Namrata ji later, not now, on media. But you touched on one very interesting issue, that there are some common things between think tanks and media outlets, that both of them engaged in evidence-based issues, present with the substance, and contribute from their part to the ongoing dialogues of debates. Next, we have Dr. Bishnu Upreti. He's leading the Policy Research Institute, long been engaged in Nepal's development and conflict resolution. Sir, could you highlight on whether Nepal think tanks provide with the specialized knowledge to the ongoing debate or dialogues concerning foreign affairs? Also, are you happy with the way that Nepal's media disseminate stories relating to the foreign affairs issues? Sometimes they may be called as sensitive one. Over to you, Dr. Upreti.
Thank you, Laxman ji. Thanks to all participants attending this conference. A few points first I would like to highlight. I completely agree with the Kosh ji that think tank and media can play a very complementary role, which is not yet really materialized. Some sporadic practices could have happened, but it is not so much. And to what extent think tank are able to influence the Nepal's foreign policy, we have to look bit about the history of the think tank in Nepal. It is relatively new in understanding, in function. Some of them emerge as a NGO and gradually developing. So history of think tank in Nepal is not strong as in the West. And also one of the serious limitations of the majority of think tank institution, particularly in non-governmental sector, is resource dependency, because they have to rely mostly on the donors fund, which are very much coming to their own priority with some sort of vested interest, and always the question of the independence comes in. However, despite these limitations, still I think in past few years, the role of think tank is increasing, and they are also working in more mature way. they are also trying to professionalize, but in your question about the satisfactory, it's very, very relative really. Because the policy making process, not only the foreign policy, almost all policy making process in Nepal is somehow managed in very limited way, without full consultation, without meaningful engagement of the key stakeholders who will be affected from such a policy. And because of such limitation, Nepal's policy making is not so much in the limelight, in the debate, in the discussion. That is one part I realize. The second part, the role different think tanks are playing, because in Nepal there are, like in other countries, there are different type of think tanks emerging, mainly the government think tanks like the PRI, IFA, National Planning Commission, and a few others. But there are several think tank institutions emerging in non-governmental sector, and they are also trying to do their best to specialize and provide substantive input to the government. Basically, whether they are governmental or non-governmental, core function of the think tank is to generate the evidences and to help the policy maker to build the policy, formulate the policy based on that evidences. The second one and most important is to engage public, to bring the public voice, document them, synthesize them, and reach to the government. That will help to develop the ownership. Without ownership of the public policy, it will not work, whether it is foreign policy or whether it is a fiscal policy or any type of the policy. So first and foremost should be the ownership of that policy needs to be owned by the key stakeholder, which is still relatively lacking. And the third part is also providing the evidences to the media who will generate and exert the public pressure. Of course, media work is somehow investigative, but it is not always to the depth which requires to make some certain type of the policy. Regarding your satisfaction, are you satisfied with the role of the media? I am not. Now, except few, majority of the media are not really substantially engaged in particular issue. I have my first-hand experiences, except few media, when I was the chair of this Limpua Dhura Lipulek evidence-related high-level task force. And at that time, I was very closely watching to the Indian and Nepali media's role in that process. And they were so superficial. What we are doing, I am the evidence, but they are writing entirely different than what I was doing. The India, it's out of even the context. They were blaming whatever they like. So when some serious matter comes, I realize Nepal's media needs to work further, build further, and engage more responsibly, particularly to the issue of the national interest. There, I see still a lot. Korean relation is really a national interest issue. And because of some writing of media could jeopardize or could strengthen the relationship. So in that part, we need to do a lot, but it's not only the responsibility of the media, it's also the responsibility of the state and the think tanks as well. If we are able to engage the journalists with specialized on the particular area, then at that time, both institutions and both parties will be mutually benefited. So capacity building as well as streamlining the concern. In that sense, what I say, we have to do a lot. Policy Research Institute is a government think tank with a specific task like examining the existing public policy, including foreign policy, and providing the evidences to the government of Nepal to adapt, to improve that, to identify the new policy area where Nepal needs to bring the new policy, provide the evidences for that, and also try to help them to formulate the policy. So in that sense, the state-owned think tank has a very specific role compared to the other think tanks. And there, again, we have to really work hard to collaborate with the state and non-state think tank, because evidences generated by whoever it is, whether it is university system, whether it is private think tank, whether it is other type of the institution who are doing research, bringing the evidences with the rigorous methodology and strong conceptual theoretical foundation, this research will have quite important findings, and these findings needs to reach to the government for the policy making, and there the think tank can play the role, particularly the government think tank. So for me, based on 2 years of rigorous examination of the existing policy and its weaknesses, what we realize, we have to develop the methodology. We have to develop the policy formulation methodology. We have to develop the policy review methodology, and we have to strictly follow this methodology, and then it will ensure the ownership of concerned stakeholder, and it will be effective later. I will stop here, and if there are any other further issue, I am happy to debate on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bishnu Upreti, for your insights on both the role of think tanks and media, and the way you presented with your working with the media. I will carry that questions to our next speaker, maybe the last speaker for the first session of this part. I would like to invite Professor Mohan Lohani. I'm seeking your insights on whether you are happy with the way think tanks have been working. There is one criticism for think tanks, be that of the governmental or non-governmental, or sometimes serving to public discourse in different names. The criticism is that the substance or the research or the way they work is not independent, and they are also inclined towards some sort of politically vested interest. Do you agree to that fact? Plus, we are also seeking your insights on how best think tanks of Nepal could contribute towards making of Nepal's foreign policy. Over to you, Professor Lohani.
Thank you, Mr. Pant, chairperson of this session. Before I proceed further, let me apologize for my very, let's say, hoarse throat. I've got very cold and cough for the last 3-4 days, so my voice has become very hoarse. So please excuse me for that. And let me begin by thanking the organizer, particularly Dr. Pramod Jaiswal, who invited me to share my views on this particular issue, the role of think tanks. I'm going to focus on 2 think tanks, I have been associated with. First of all, the Nepal Council of World Affairs, the oldest organization of this country. It was established in 1948, 73 years ago. And it has had 21 presidents so far. It was set up when the Rana regime was still very much in the seat of power. It was ruling. And then we had 1951, the overthrow of the Rana regime, followed by the nearly 3 decades of Panchayat rule, when the kings were very powerful during that period. Then we had this 1990 change, restoration of multi-party democracy, which continued for some time. And before, let us say, it was overtaken by the insurgency movement, the Maoist insurgency, which lasted 10 years, from 1996 to 2006. And this insurgency, it came to an end, and it really triggered the election to the Constituent Assembly, which was entrusted with the task of promulgating a new constitution in 2015. So, you know, this is, and all through all these phases, the Nepal Council of World Affairs was very much alive. So it has witnessed all ups and downs of political change and other changes in socio-economic sphere, cultural sphere. So the Nepal Council of World Affairs, because, you know, we have very two big neighbors, India to the south and China to the north. We have the Nepal Council has established good relations with the Indian Council of World Affairs. You know, it is called ICWA, whereas Nepal Council is known as NCWA. And likewise, the China, you know, talking about ICWA, there is a difference between NCWA and ICWA. ICWA, it is chaired by the Vice President of India. So its role is very influential, ICWA's. Whereas, you know, NCWA has had presidents, so many presidents. The first president was Vijay Shamsher, who was the son of then Prime Minister Mohan Shamsher, you know. And he was also ambassador, Nepal's ambassador to New Delhi, Vijay Shamsher. And Vijay Shamsher was followed by a number of intellectuals, diplomats, and let's say senior bureaucrats, persons like, you see, Narendra Mani, he was former foreign secretary. Then we had Professor Rishikesha, former foreign minister and a scholar. And then followed Dr. Bhek Thapa, who was also our, you know, ambassador to both India and America. So like, and then we had scholars like Professor B.C. Malla, Professor Surendra Bahadur Shrestha, Professor Surilal Matya, Professor Lokraj Baral. He was also ambassador to India, Lokraj Baral. Then, you know, like this, it just, and our, the present incumbent of the Nepal Council of World Affairs is Mr. Hemant Kharel. He comes from civil service bureaucracy with pretty long experience. So I was just telling you that NCWA has relations with Indian Council of World Affairs and also relation with Chinese think tanks like Chinese Institute for Contemporary International Relations, in short form CICIR, and then Chinese Association for International Understanding, CAFIU, you know. So these are very influential institutes in China, like ICWA of India. And so far as, you know, the functions of NCWA are concerned, let me just highlight a few, you know, because, you know, it's not possible for me to go into its long history of 73 years. So many things have happened. We invited foreign dignitaries who were on a visit to Nepal, and they were very happy to address the Nepal Council of World Affairs. To take an example from India itself, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru addressed the Nepal Council, and then, you know, Mrs. Gandhi addressed it, and then Dr. Sarvapalli Radhakrishnan, President Sarvapalli, you know, he was really a sharp intellectual, widely known as a philosopher, and he also addressed the Nepal Council, and the audience listened to him spellbound. You know, he spoke for more than 1 hour, and extempore speech, spoke about philosophy, he spoke about religion, he spoke about international relations, very wide-ranging subjects, you know, Dr. Radhakrishnan. And we had also dignitaries from abroad, and two dignitaries, let me mention, Dr. Henry Kissinger and Dr. Bishnu Brzezinski. They visited Nepal in 1983. No, I'm sorry, and in 1985, when I was president of that council. From 1983 to 1987, I was president of Nepal Council of World Affairs, and Henry Kissinger and Bishnu Brzezinski, they addressed the council at an interval of 2 weeks. 2 weeks before Kissinger came and addressed, it was Brzezinski who addressed the council, and they touched on many issues, of let's say international issues. And to give you, the Nepal Council of World Affairs is not a state-sponsored institution. Right from the beginning, since its inception, it has, of course, it received some grant from government of Nepal, very modest grant, but not fully state-sponsored. But the other institute, of which I was executive director, Institute of Foreign Affairs, it is of course state-sponsored. I will tell something about the institute a little later, but first let me focus on Nepal Council of World Affairs. It has been addressed by, I just told you, heads of state and government of different countries, UN Secretary Generals, all UN Secretary Generals who visited Nepal, they made it a point to address the Nepal Council of World Affairs. Yeah. All UN Secretary Generals. So, and we had the dignitaries from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka. They were happy to address the Nepal Council of World Affairs. And the Nepal Council of World Affairs, it organizes workshops, seminars, dialogues on contemporary issues of national and international importance. But it is not, these workshops are not confined only to foreign affairs or international relations. They also they are focused on the economy of the country, peace and security, social issues, and even the constitution. The latest constitution, which was promulgated in 2015, the Nepal Council of World Affairs organized a symposium on the let us say the merits and demerits of the new constitution. So this was and of course it has been publishing annual journal since its inception, you see, and all issues are there in the Nepal Council of World Affairs right from the beginning, you see. And this, if any research scholar wants to go through the contemporary issues of that period, they can go to the NCWA library and rummage through the back issues, past issues, and these issues really throw light on contemporary issues. And we have also had exchange of scholars, visits. We entered into partnership with Indian Council of World Affairs, with Pakistan.
Lohani, sorry to interrupt you while you are sharing very interesting historical anecdotes. Because of time, I would like to request you to wrap up on this part. You will have a chance to respond to a few of our questions from our audience later.
Okay, let me now, of course, this much because I have been associated with this council with a long history, very checkered history. I thought I should brief the audience about its how it came into being, its functions, its activities, its relations with like-minded institutions in other countries. But anyway, I will stop here, and then I will move on to another Institute of Foreign Affairs, which became an semi-autonomous institute in 1998. Before that, this institute was a wing of the Foreign Ministry, the Institute of Foreign Affairs. But from 1998, it was given semi-autonomous status, and with, of course, its own responsibility to formulate its own policies, formulate its own talk program, three functions were given to this institute: training of new recruits from Public Service Commission, and before they were allotted this special task in the Foreign Ministry, they have to undergo training, which is provided by the Institute of Foreign Affairs. And secondly, is orientation program for ambassador, outgoing ambassador. All newly appointed ambassadors, they have to attend week-long orientation program. This is also one of the important functions of the Institute of Foreign Affairs. And secondly, research and publication. That is also one of its important jobs. And third, documentation. It is also entrusted with the task of preserving very precious documents of the country, because our documents are in disarray. Even in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, if you, I remember one of the foreign ministers with whom I worked, he wanted some documents on the non-paper sent to India, and this non-paper was missing there. You see, it was not available. He was really very disappointed. I would like to refer to the doyen of Nepal foreign policy, Professor Y.N. Khanal, a very noted scholar. He was foreign secretary and also ambassador to 3 countries. He was ambassador to India, he was ambassador to China, he was also ambassador to the United States of America. And when I was executive director of the Institute of Foreign Affairs, because he was my guru, he taught us English at Trichandra College. And I approached him, sir, we have completed this training program for new recruits. Would you like to share your experience with these new recruits so that they will be enlightened and they will be encouraged to work more professionally? He had, of course, I have prepared a 2-page thing, but I'm not going to read out the entire thing. Some of the highlights, of what Professor Khanal said. He said he called for seriousness on the part of all concerned: politicians, policymakers, academics, media persons, in dealing with both foreign policy and foreign service. That was the first point he said. And then he also had something to say about our neighbors, India and China, because he was ambassador to both China and India. And he said the vital interest of India and China in Nepal and the latter's similar interest in its immediate neighbors can neither be minimized nor overemphasized. So Professor Khanal was of the view that there is nothing unusual if a small country comes under pressure from a big neighbor. For example, well, of course, he is referring to these two big neighbors, both India and China. He distinguishes pressure from threat. He distinguishes pressure from threat with a different connotation. But what is important is the strength or ability of a country, however small, to withstand the external pressure. This leads one to question whether Nepal, sandwiched between India and China, has the requisite strength, resilience, and assertiveness to stand up to pressure no matter where it comes from. And of course, he has other points, but towards the end, in his concluding remarks, he said he cited the instance of the European community, which did not accept within its 4 countries like Spain and Portugal, so long as they were under dictatorship. So Professor Khanal emphasized the importance of democracy, which is also related to the formulation of foreign policy. And now, as regards SAARC, South Asian National Regional Cooperation, he said both India and Pakistan as vital countries of this association, they must be prepared for a give and take attitude if regional cooperation is to move forward and yield results. So, this is how Professor Khanal shared his experience with these new recruits of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 1998. And some of these recruits today, they have been appointed ambassadors. One has gone to Pakistan, another has gone to Canada as ambassadors, you know, because they were fresh recruits in 1998 for PSC, Public Service Commission, but during the last 20 years, they were promoted as joint secretaries and they have been appointed ambassadors.
Well,
thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Lohani, for shedding light on many historical anecdotes, contribution of individuals and think tank organization in Nepal towards making of Nepal's foreign policy. We would like to listen to you, but due to time constraint, I'm moving ahead with another panelist who are with us, Ms. Namrata Sharma. Ms. Namrata Sharma, Professor Lohani touched on many issues. It makes a lot of references for Nepali media to highlight on when it comes to both bilateral or multilateral relations, or sometimes that of the disputes that are made here in Nepal through media content. Do you think that the criticism that comes in and around for Nepali media serving to a particular interest-seeking favor for their functioning, often sidelining the national interest and democratic values, do you think that a line can be drawn between national interest and the state security with respect to the role of media? Over to you, Namrata-ji.
Thank you, Laxman-ji. Laxman-ji, Dr. Jaiswal, and the entire NIICE Nepal team. I would like to first of all thank you for having me with you today in this very, very interesting discourse that has been going over from yesterday onwards, I think. Unfortunately, I was not able to join in them. They look very interesting. Listening to the speakers before me, a lot has already been covered. And I'm going to answer your question, Laxman-ji, but in a little bit roundabout way, but I'll keep to my time. As you know, I do that usually. You know, I see both media and think tanks. I'm going to take this together to answer your question as ubiquitous policy actors, actually, in the advancement of liberal democracies and authoritarian regimes, frankly speaking. And just now, when you were listening to Dr. Lohani, he took us through the Rana regime till now, you know, and if you look at the transition and the way impact of think tanks and the way media, whatever form of media, whether it was in Janga Bahadur's time or right now in the ever-changing Oli, Deuba, Prachanda, whatever time, you know, at that time also there was media. At that time too, Dr. Upreti, there were think tanks, but I think in different forms and formats, you see. So even in authoritarian regimes, there are people whom the rulers always look to for advice, thinking that, you know, these come from the learned and it has to be taken. So they took it in their own way, and the learned of that time, quote unquote, gave it in their own way. Then there was form of communication information, which came out from the rulers on whatever policies that was being formed to the people and outside of Nepal. So that has been continuing now. Then it could have been just some favorable educated elites in the Raja, Shah, Panchayat regime, and even multi-party system during the early 90s when democracy was restored in Nepal, and now coming to even the social mass media. But what has been happening in Nepal is certain group of information comes out and it is related out to the people. And again, when this relating cycle forms the overall basis of the foreign policy, and then, you know, like, although even during the whole 2-day session, starting from yesterday, I've been hearing a lot of focus on India-China relation with Nepal. That is true. But if you sit back and relax and review the overall foreign policy roles of think tank and media of whatever form, right from the Rana regime till now, you can see that although these two neighboring neighbors are overruling and very obvious foreign actors to us nearby, but there has been influences of the British, the Americans, and other European actors throughout Nepal's history, you see. And frankly speaking, the way a lot of things hovers about over India and China and Nepal is basically the outcome of how and what input the think tanks and the media in general has been playing within Nepal and outside Nepal to kind of lay the overall foreign policy of the country. You know, there's one thing that the state wants to send out, and there's another thing that the think tanks and the media brings out. There is, of course, like Kosh earlier also mentioned, Koshji, that I see a very much of a symbiotic relationship between media and think tanks. You know, media has to get their information out, and think tanks have to release the information, the research that they do, right? And there is a whole team of investigative journalists who dig into and get quality information, but they need to verify and check, triangulate whether what they have found is correct or not, or whether there's a different side to the hypothesis and the research findings that they themselves have done. And then comes the role of the think tank. And then we bring it out. But in this whole process, till now, how has the foreign policy shaped? You know, the way I look at things, Dr. Lohani, I don't see him on the screen now. When democracy was restored in Nepal in 1990, he was one of the think tanks that I used to knock the doors to validate some of the information I was finding out. And then I'm you know, and there are different aspects of foreign policy in Nepal. There are direct foreign policy with countries, but there's a lot of things that hits on the, particularly after, either before or after restoration of democracy and establishment of multi-party system, a lot of things on how multilateral, bilateral relationships are linked, especially where grant, donor, you know, development aspects are. Sometimes, you know, then I look at a three-dimensional structure, you see. The three-dimensional structure that comes to my mind is, I always put people as the main actor and the main pillar of any structure, you see. And then there is the state and the system. Now in Nepal, foreign policy is not an overnight thing. You know, although we now have almost 3 decades of struggling of restoration of democracy, you know, this whole ubiquitous approach of media and think tanks trying to influence the liberal democratic setback coming from very authoritarian systems in the country, you know, and how does the state and the systems in the country play to take the main center role of the people, even as far as foreign policy is concerned, is something that is lacking. Now, how does the think tank and the media play a role in this? You know, when I see the very first, one of the biggest development projects that came into Nepal after restoration of democracy was Arun 3 Hydro project. And at that time, Dr. Lohani, you were just taking a break. I just mentioned your name, saying that after restoration of democracy, you were one of the think tanks that I used to knock my door to validate some of the findings I had, to do my reportings and all. And we used to have lots of discussions on various aspects, you know. So this symbiotic relationship between think tanks and journalists are always there. But how do think tanks make sure what their research finding comes is actually for the people and the state, rather than other aspects, you know, is what the think tanks always need to bring out. And as far as journalists are concerned, how do we journalists dig out our own information and then validate and see and triangulate it with what the think tanks have is very, very important, you know. But in this validation process, one thing that we all know in Nepal, no matter what, you know, look at the mess the judiciary is at the moment now. Even judiciary, everywhere politics is the overpowering structural default, I feel, you know. And that is where in that 3-dimension of structure, people and state that I talked to you about, politics is so much controlling factor. They have, whether there's an election of the bar, whether there's an election of the federal Nepal Federation of Nepal Journalists, or there is a election of the think tanks in whatever capacity, you know, the whole political influence and candidates supporting by this party and the other part is winning, you know, is become so much prevalent in the minds of these factions. So the whole overall policy of the country, and particularly the foreign policy, gets influenced by these aspects also. So how do we now learn to rise beyond that? You know, the systems that in the three triangulations that I was talking about, the systems have changed drastically since the authoritative regime, you know, and now we are in setting up the liberal democratic system. But unfortunately, we are struggling a lot. And while we are struggling, we are always influenced by outside, and we either let them influence, but on the other hand, and in Nepal and people around Nepal, you know, countries around Nepal try to make the relationship between Nepal, India, and China so much a concentration that the overall global impact and relationship with global community often gets diluted, you see. So the way I look at it is, whether we like it or not, there has been an influence of think tanks and media over the years. It's happening now. It's going to happen in future too. Well, the example of the recent land dispute between Nepal and India was brought out by many of the speakers. I'm not going to get into it. But because of the fact that the media has now entered big scale into the digital world, we have to be very notable of the fact that, you know, the way media and think tank used to influence in the earlier days are going to change. It is already changing, and it's going to change in the days to come. You know, with the young people access to information and overnight becoming think tanks and journalists, you know, majority of the citizens, how do we strike the balance, and how do we look at the way it's going to impact the foreign policy is a big question for tomorrow. Then coming to Laxmanji's question, is it was related, or if I remember now after speaking so long, is I think you're asking me, Laxmanji, is it justifiable that there is a criticism on how media is bringing out the overall policies in the country and relating it to the foreign policy, right? I agree. There is criticism in everything, not only media, not only think tanks. I also look at, you and I know that if you look at even just 4 decades in Nepal, you will see same actors, same think tanks were there 2 or 3 decades before that also, you know? And as the regimes change, the actors are still there, but their stance of the support of the system that is there in the country changes, you see? So how does that impact on the foreign policy? Because the connection between Nepal and whichever country you are dealing with, if it's the same actors playing over a period of time, you know, and even if you look at neighboring countries who have done research and have been working with Nepal, most of the influencers with Nepal seem to be the same. So have they actually changed with the way media is changing over the years, and how and in what form reflections and impact can be made? Now looking at still, unfortunately, in Nepal's history, because of this political encroachment, I call it, you know, encroachment in almost every development aspect of the country, it is still a dilemma on how actually unbiased and individual logical philosophy of what should be Nepal's foreign policy to come is still a big challenge, I think. Well, I'm here, and I don't want to take too much time. I know Laxmanji is feeling pressurized with time, but if you have a few more minutes, I can still speak a few more minutes more. But if you want me to stop now and answer questions.
Thank you very much, Namrata. There are many questions raised by our audiences in the social media page, and I have been passed those questions with me. But yes, thank you, Namrata ji, for the moment. But I would like to start for there. Actually, very few questions on media role. So I would like to start from Kosh ji. Then I move into other panelists on some of the questions raised by our audience on social media. There are a few questions on whether media and think tank collaboration in Nepal is feasible idea. But before you respond to that, what Namrata ji has told, since you are in the newsroom, Koshi, do you agree that our inside surveillance is so weak that stories are not validated with the ever since presence of think tanks, individuals and organizations, what Professor Lohani presented before us just before Namrata ji? How strong is our verification process when it comes to the very sensitive and serious bilateral or multilateral relations, including that of the recent, border dispute and all? Over to you, Koshi, very briefly.
Thank you very much. I think this is highly, contextual and relevant question. Of course, it is feasible idea if we journalists are kind of, if we are, considerate about our roles and responsibilities. The thing is, like, what I find is, being in a newsroom, what I find is, media people are always in kind of, pressure to create certain news on a daily basis. And they, most of the time, they are, rushing to produce news. And in most cases, as you said, many journalists, they do not actually try to validate. Even if they validate, just, they simply talk to some expert. Sometimes those experts may not necessarily be the expert of the subject matter they are talking about. And, without verifying it with other experts, they tend to, publish that news. And I think it is also about the waiting process in the newsroom, because those of us who are in the leadership also are kind of, pressurized, limited human resource, and on daily basis you are supposed to produce something, and that I can find in daily newsroom, the newsroom of daily newspapers. There's often kind of pressure, like, there are many news that are, already disseminated by online media platform, and you got to do, give something new. You are always under pressure. And if your reporter comes with certain new information, and yeah, of course, you ask your reporter, have you validated this, or have you talked to some expert? Then he says, okay, I have talked to expert, kind of thing. And you tend to believe to the reporters, and we just publish that. And oftentimes, what happens is, like, those news sometime, in most cases, let's not say most cases, but many times, we find that those news are not correct. That is what is happening. And yes, the collaboration between think tank and media, I think that's a feasible idea if the think tank organization are also readily able to respond to media's queries. For example, like, reporters are always in rush, and for example, if they have something to write about this Kalapani issues, then they may ask to some think tank officials, and if they say, okay, I can respond to you only after 2 days, there is always kind of a strategic vacuum. If that happens, then reporters will start finding alternatives, and sometimes he or she does not reach to the right person. And even then, reporters, they just tend to produce news, and ultimately that gets published. So I think we got to improve ourselves, like, even journalists, even think tank organization. Also, when we talk about think tank, we have limited think tanks. For example, if I'm writing on foreign affairs issues, so I am supposed to talk to IFA, for example, right? IFA officials, and there are only few other institutions, non-governmental think tank, and also it's very difficult to get proper quotes. And also there are people who have not much, I mean, it's difficult to find people who have made research on that particular topic. For instance, like we talked about this Kalapani issue, there were hardly few people who had actually made study on this border dispute. Oftentimes, we just talk, Buddhinaran Shrestha, Yes, and of course we quote him, and also like we try to find others, then hardly other people. So I think there's a long way to go, I would say.
Of course, just an addition to your one of the questions raised here in chat box. What is stopping media to dig deep on these issues? You agreed that yes, there are serious concerns that needed to come into media, but they are not coming into. What are the obstacles?
Yeah, I think there's a big issue that I find, these days, I don't see many people, joining journalism, to develop career, to build their career in journalism. And there seems to be like in our time, like for example, I joined Kathmandu Post back in 2004. And there was a time like, a large number of people, they just wanted to, build career. But these days, I can see, especially those in like English newsroom, that you find English newsroom is often called forever young, because you don't see, older people there in the newsroom, because most of them in the mid-career level and they start, switching their profession. Some of them go to NGOs and all this. And even younger generation, there's no, charm, these days I don't see many, younger people, joining journalism. Yeah, of course, in Nepali media, Nepali language media, I can see, some flow of youth, trying to build career in journalism. But then I think, not many people seem to be interested in building career. And now, yes, that is one thing. And another thing is like, it's also about passion, like how much, hard work you actually want to, make on a particular story. You are like, if you are in a daily newspaper's newsroom, you're already under pressure. Now you need to produce certain news, at least one news a day. That is one pressure. And also like, if you are not really passionate about the subject that you're writing about, then I think you not make further research. And there's also limitation of resources. Like, media houses are also not able to produce. For example, if you just talk about New York Times, one reporters can even spend like 6 months to produce one single story. And they are provided with all sort of, guidance, necessary financial resources and other kinds of resources. And that is something, the media houses in our country are not able to afford. And they have not been like doing that. And also it's because of COVID-19, you see the newsroom has already shrunk down. The number of, journalists in the newsroom has come down, like many were laid off, and still media have not been able to, come back to the normalcy. So there are so many issues. I would say it's about lack of resources. It's about, the passion of journalists. And also sometimes you're talking about like disinformation, misinformation thing also. Like if you really work hard, if you try to validate information, then only like there are chances that we can control this misinformation and disinformation thing also. So lots of issues. There's a long way to go, I would say. And I think we need to do something. And for example, I myself, I'm trying to ensure that, in my newsroom, these kind of things do not happen. So this is it for now. I just want to stop here.
Thank you. Thank you, Kosh, for your responses to the questions. I now would like to move with Dr. Bishnu Upreti. Actually, there are many questions. I would like to summarize them and put before you a few questions for this time. How do you think that the think tanks differ from universities and academia? Also would like to merge one more questions for you here. Having witnessed that realities are differently reported in policies report, what could be the roles and responsibilities of direct witness in correcting the report? Also, this question further reads, how often do think tanks expose such realities via mass media? Over to you, Dr. Bishnu Upreti.
Thank you, Laxman-ji. One of the fundamental important difference between the academic institution, research institution, and think tank is that think tank are problem solving, solution oriented in nature. Second part, If we look to the research cycle, one of the important elements in the think tank work is identifying the policy gap and bringing the policy recommendations, which often the standard research institution in their research cycle don't do. They do with the research gap. So that these two are technically. The third one, the research, mainly the research in the academia, they are not shaped by the immediate public policy concern, but more by level of understanding. So the theoretical framework, conceptual analytical schema, methodological rigorousness, these are some of the crucial and which are needed to fulfill certain academic requirement of the universities if they are doing by the universities or to understand. So basically, one important theoretical proposition we can put here is that think tank do research for knowledge, for understanding, and understanding for improvement. But the academic institutions and research institutions do research on knowledge for understanding. So the understanding for improvement is second part. Often the journalist, media, or policymaker, they could pull from there and interpret themselves. But the policy think tank often don't stop there. So that is the key difference. Based on my 10 years of working in European universities and another 10 years working with different global and national think tanks, what I realize is that think tank, they have to produce the very context-specific, policy-relevant output to help to the policy maker to solve the problem. If there is any, for example, when we have this COP26 meeting in Glasgow, our policy maker, our decision maker needs the instant but the evidences. And for that, team of the scholar, team of the policy researcher needs to work and provided the hands-on information based on the evidences to the policy maker. So often the academic research doesn't do that. They have the consistent, persistent, long-term engagement on a specific issue to understand. If you look to the Western universities, one person is engaged for 26, 30, 40 years on the same thematic issue, the thematic topics. But here in the think tank, it doesn't work. The second question which was asked by Usha Regmi-ji, yes, often mainly in the developing countries, and sometimes because of the political reasoning, even in the developed country, which I witnessed sometime, they interpret the reality differently. The manipulation of the data, the level of the poverty, for example, the manipulation of the data for the number of the hunger people in certain parts. Sometimes this type of the data comes because there is no rigorous research. What does the rigorous means? Conceptually clear, methodologically rigor, and asking right question and answering the right way. So if we are not doing that, and if very quick and dirty type of the documentation, at that time the manipulator have the easy alternatives to show that. So that is the real problem in developing country. If we look to the data generated in African countries, rather say least developed countries, the rigorousness is not there. That is the reason there is always problem. The role of the think tank is to generate the evidences based on the concrete cases and to demonstrate that these are the data because of that reason. And at that time, the media can use that data. What I see, despite the history of some of the institutions emerging for long since Rana time or whatever it is, they are not really able to contribute what the nation is needed. For example, now the context is so changed in our part of the world, this COVID itself, geostrategic dynamics and many other things We have to have the new response strategy of every state, and for that there is a need of the evidences. Some countries who give the priority to the research and the think tank work, they allocate the resource, they develop the training. Kosh ji very rightly said that there are really lack of competent research scholars to provide the specific evidences on particular issue. Often very sweeping generalization, sometime reading to the Republica or the Kathmandu Post or any newspaper, and based on that they are coming as expert and giving. That is not what the think tank needs to do. Think tank needs to do very rigorous research based on the evidences. They have to come and propose, and that research findings media can elaborate or can disseminate, can bring to the public and create the positive pressure to change the policy. So in that sense, Usha ji, there is a very clear link, but still we are lacking in that part. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Upreti. There are many questions. I would like Dr. Shubhra Chaturvedi to respond to a question on role of government of Nepal expanding the role of think tanks. What could be the role of Nepal government on expanding role of think tanks? Over to you, Dr. Shubhra.
Thank you, Chair. It's been quite interesting listening to the different perspectives. And from what I could gather, I'll try to keep it a direct answer. Government's role in expanding the think tanks and their role in foreign policy analysis, it kind of comes back to the basic issue of resources. How will the resources be managed? Because that seems to be a big challenge. I'm actually taking something from what Professor Lohani said, that the foundation has been laid out by organizations like NCWA, and the government needs to come up with sort of programs that support those organizations much more through focused channels of financing, as well as letting the democratic spirit prevail. Because like I was listening to all the discussions, and my concern comes that think tanks can, they do have a freedom to have an opinion, and that will be categorized as an academic opinion. Whereas media is expected to serve whatever has happened as is. If there is an opinion, then that's categorized as biased. So I'm not sure how we can overcome this challenge, but maybe a little more transparency with respect to issues like India-Nepal dispute or misunderstanding. Maybe a little more transparency at the initial level will help clear out the confusions that have been created, and the public opinion and the nationalistic feelings that were coming up. That probably wasn't that much of required. So I believe that more of transparency, focusing a little more on how the resources can be managed. And then, there are always these distinctions between, are you an NGO, are you a think tank? Is it really necessary, as long as they are catering to the knowledge diffusion? I'm just opening it for everyone to respond. I'm not sure how that really works in favor, as long as it's working towards helping create a sort of awareness towards issues. And I would actually try to promote the idea that was put forward by Dr. Upreti and Mr. Koirala both, that maybe a collaboration between think tanks and media could be promoted by government schemes. I know there are some in place, but maybe more of these, like in India, there is a full mechanism, there's a governmental organ that is working towards promoting that. So maybe something on that lines will really help bring this issue to forefront. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Chaturvedi. a few questions there. I'm trying to summarize. And yes, Professor Lohani, you told us a lot of historical things with the role of think tanks and the individuals in the making of Nepal's foreign policy. Could you enlighten us how the remarkable contributions of think tank that shaped Nepal's foreign policy in many instances that you told could continue today? What do you expect from the think tanks currently operating in Nepal in different notions to contribute towards making of Nepal's foreign policy? Over to you, sir. Could you check your mic, unmute it?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, please.
Yeah. No, I have before me the latest publication of the Nepal Council of World Affairs entitled Nepal Standing Up to Domestic and Foreign Challenges. The Council only a year and a half ago, it set up 5 thematic committees. Each committee dealing with international relations and economic diplomacy. Second committee, immediate neighbors and neighborhood relations. Third committee, dealing with good governance and sustainable development. And the fourth, Nepal's national security in a changed context. And the fifth one, human rights situation in Nepal. Very wide-ranging is these 5 thematic committees, and they each thematic committee consisting of not less than 25 or 30 members of the council, because the council membership, it consists of nearly 400, 300 are live members, and 100 members are ordinary members, and they come from different professional backgrounds. They are lawyers, they are former bureaucrats, they are former diplomats, mostly university scholars. So representing a very cross-section of society, and each thematic committee was composed of people from different walks of life. And of course, one of the committees was also convened by me. That was international relations and economic diplomacy. In the same way, other committees also, they were convened by very learned scholars. And it was launched last February by the then Foreign Minister, Mr. Pradeep Giwali. So we handed it over to the government minister for their perusal, for their, let us say, assessment of this report. The problem with the Nepal Council of World Affairs, it took pains to prepare this report, involving all experts and involving so many former bureaucrats, diplomats, academics, etc. But often, this is not taken seriously, and government people don't take it seriously. They don't go through it, and they do not invite the council members and those experts involved in the preparation of this book to discuss. So there should be, my point of view is that there should be interaction. There will be lively interaction. Of course, government people, they find they are not happy with some of the recommendations of this report. Let us discuss it frankly, in a frank manner. But it was handed over, and there is no response. So this lack of response means that we did our job, but in a very fruitless way.
Thank you very much, Professor Lohani. I just looking into my watch, and we have very little time. But yes, before we sum up, and before I go with all of you with a very limited time, maybe 2 minutes each, to present with your final thoughts for way forward, what can be done to make the role of both think tanks and media vibrant relations to making of Nepal's foreign policy. I would like to provide a short time to Namrata Sharma to respond on A few of the questions, actually, I'm summarizing them. And yes, you said that media faces a crisis of validation. What do you recommend to Nepal's newsroom, especially the inside surveillance, the editorial gatekeeping, to look into so that appropriate and less disinformation, or say no disinformation, is disseminated through our media in relations to foreign affairs issues? Namrata ji.
Okay, thank you, Laxman ji. Actually, yes, a lot of misinformation and disinformation is being circulated at the moment, and it's basically because of the big way media has hit the digital world. I think there are a few things that can be done. I think editors need to be more vigilant on this aspect, and it's very heartening to hear editors like Kosh ji openly saying that, admitting the fact that they need to do more. What I see is, initially when the country's media was controlled only by the government, there was little people could do, and it was controlled completely by the state. Now also there is state media, but unfortunately, even the corporate media, the private sector media, which has now become corporatized, has their own censoring inside, you see. So frankly speaking, editors have double challenges in Nepal these days. There are restrictions even in this Federal Republic state of Nepal. There are lots of restrictions by the state on media in all 7 provinces. And then on top of that, there are corporatized media houses who have their own restrictions too. So first of all, I think there is still lack of proper reporting skills of journalists, and especially on specialized subjects like foreign affairs and all, like Kosh ji already admitted to the fact, you see. But then, even if there is lack of expertise, there has to be mentoring done by editors, right? And resources for that mentoring is still lacking. Unfortunately, if you look on the other side, you see lots of Nepali journalists going from one training to another. However, the actual capacity of reporting in such a way you unearth your own findings on certain issues, then you dig the help and information from think tanks. How do journalists do that? I think so there is still a lot of focus that needs to be done by editors, and the resources has to be allocated by the corporate sector for the capacity building of journalists. But on the other hand, the journalists themselves and editors themselves also need to move away from the biases they have with the political party and the governing government of the country, and also the corporatized media owners. It is very difficult, but it has to be done. And for that, the developing of the capacity of journalists to sense a news, follow it, get information on their own, and then validate it with the think tanks. The other problem I see in Nepal is the validation is always sought for 1 or 2 or same people time after time, you see, because they are available, they'll be willing to give. But the journalists now have to develop a capacity of finding different people, different gender, different class, caste, ethnicity. And I'll tell you one thing, we cannot get away now by saying there aren't enough people. There may not be enough, large number of people, but if you really take time and find, you can find sources of different backgrounds who can actually share information for you. We don't necessarily have to go to the same people again, because if we keep on doing that, we will be publishing the same news. As far as disinformation and misinformation is given, I feel a lot of things are planted, by different interest groups, especially in the relationship between India and Nepal. I have lots of Indian friends, and they keep on asking me, Namrata, why do Nepalis hate us? I said, Nepalis never hate you, and I don't think Indians hate us either. But the way the media, and particularly this television media, is playing, and people going after the YouTubes and all that thing, that is where we need to now start focus. I was talking about the three structural factors: people, state, and system. Systems are developing in their own way. States are, although in the Federal Republic state of Nepal, they're still very much, they still have a lot of aspects of authoritarian regime in there, although they're trying to move towards liberal democracy. But now, how do we manipulate the system so that we have a general population who is aware of what misinformation and disinformation is? I think we need to move towards that, make people digitally literate. That should be the bottom line. And then, of course, editors in Nepal of previous years and Nepal's of today editors have big challenges. There are censorship everywhere. But to be good journalists, we have to rise above that, develop the skills of the journalists to dig their own information, and then go about finding the right people to validate these things or not validate. Sometimes you don't necessarily have to validate it.
Thank you, Namrata ji. I think that wraps up your final thoughts as well because of the time limitations. I'm going with Dr. Shubhra Chaturvedi. Could you share with us your final thoughts, responding also a particular question about freedom of speech being curtailed massively in India? How does that affect to the foreign relationships between countries? Maybe one of our audience in the chat box signaling that. Over to you, Shubhra, but for 2 minutes. Please unmute.
I'm going to try and keep it as short as possible. About the high concerns in South Asia with respect to freedom of speech, yes, we have had experiences like that, but there is a thin line between understanding that there are democratic values, but there are also national security issues. So, and I have personally studied very closely the concept of secrecy in national security and foreign policy making. Not everything needs to be in the public domain. However, that is also used as a curtain to kind of avoid criticism by a lot of governments. So this is definitely a concern. Since there's a lack of time, I'll quickly conclude my statements. I believe that one of the things pointed out during the discussions were that the focus of the media and think tanks in Nepal needs to move forward from just being India-centric and China-centric. There is a need to go beyond that and highlight the relationship like between Nepal and Europe. There is a lot happening there. Even with EU, there are a lot of agreements. Probably highlighting that will kind of bring Nepal out of the shadow that it has, all the politics has to be driven by what India feels or what China feels. Maybe a good combination of experts from intersections. Like in the West, it is very common for a person to have a degree in political science as well as economics to do well. So that sort of increases your exposure and your bandwidth to understand things. And I think it's not that hard to bring this culture into Nepal because I understand that there is a lot of respect for the democratic values. And I hope in the near future, we'll see a lot of change. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chaturvedi. Mr. Koirala, your final thoughts. How do you think that the verification on the sensitive foreign affairs issues be made in newsrooms? Very quickly. You are muted.
Thank you, Chair. I'm sorry, I didn't realize that I was on mute. So thank you for this. I think most of the things has been highlighted by Namrata ma'am already. And I don't need to speak much. And I agree, partly agree on many of the things he has highlighted. Of course, we have a long way to go. So I think one of the important things that we got to do is, enhance media literacy among people so that people can also kind of, point out the mistakes that media people have done. They can write, these days, it's very easy. Like you can put in the Twitter feed the information if there are anything wrong that we have made, or even in other Facebook platform or Insta, anywhere. So it's easy for people. And when talking about foreign policy thing, foreign policy is very, very sensitive thing, because even journalists are guided by the feeling of nationalism. So there is certain kind of biases. You see, when Indian journalists write about Kalapani issues, they are guided by their own nationalism. And the Nepali journalists also, they are guided by our own nationalism. So I think this sometimes, puts the evidence in the back burner, and we tend to be guided by our emotion, not by facts. So I think it's very important for us to be guided by facts rather than by emotion. So how do we do is, we need to cultivate habit of, basing our reportings on facts, evidences. And here comes the role of think tank. If the think tank people are able to provide, requisite information that journalists need, because, in our country, like, it's very difficult to find experts who are readily available to give us, feedback, comments on certain, subject matter. The reason why you find, only a few experts being quoted every time is because there are, other experts are not readily available. Sometimes what they say is, okay, let me study about this, and I can tell you the day after tomorrow. And that way, journalists are not going to, just wait for a long time. In most cases, because they are always under pressure to produce news on a daily basis. Of course, in some cases, like, they can wait, but then again, there are no readily available expert like that. And another important thing, I think we'll be missing one important aspect when we talk only about mainstream media. How about social media? For example, I can give you one good case study. If you look at media reportings, there are nothing, negative news, no negative news about MCC. But look at the social media, Twitter, look at, Facebook, look at YouTube videos. I was kind of surprised to see that there was one YouTube video in which, it just, kind of indicated where American military would be staying. Like it has just shown like the electricity pole, and then, okay, here, the US military will stay here. And this way, they are kind of disinforming people. And also very important, the trend had changed with the, onslaught of this, digital media platform. Earlier, people used to source news. People used to follow news. But now, these days, news will follow you. News follows the reader. Basically, if you're opening your mobile phone, all of a sudden, certain news comes in your screen and you start reading that. So now, how do we do it? I think, it's a bigger challenge for us is, how do we, control disinformation that is made through social media? Because everyone is journalists. Traditionally, we used to call, those of us who were working with the mainstream media, we used to call ourselves, journalists. But now, everyone is journalist. So we call, citizen journalism. So now it's a big challenge. Who do you blame? Now, how do we regulate? So I think, the most important thing is, how do we create awareness? How do we inform people about the issues? I mean, the factual information, how do we disseminate so that people can understand what exactly is the issue, not run after, certain biases, certain propaganda that is being made. So I think it's very important. So the thing is, like, we need to think about capacity building. We need to think about media, enhancing media literacy, so that people don't simply believe in what they come across, what they come to read, or what they come to hear. And also, of course, journalists need to build their capacity.
Time.
And yeah, thank you.
Yeah, because of time, yes. Sorry to interrupt you. May I now request Dr. Bishnu Upreti for his final thoughts. Dr. Upreti, what do you think? How can think tanks be actually known as the specialized agencies providing, their inputs to the ongoing dialogues and debates on foreign affairs?
Thank you. In my opinion, there are few necessary conditions or step one. The capacity, the competency of the research staff, the skill, the methodology. The second part is the resources. Often, think tank are also suffering from the minimum required resources to do. And the third is also the connecting and collaborating with the wider number of actors and stakeholders. The fourth is to orient the policy maker. Public policy maker are often ignorant of the public policy formulation cycle. Without proper process, without proper public policy making process, the result will not come. Despite the big investment, despite the whole priority, the first and foremost is starting right process. What does this mean? Identification of the problem with the key stakeholder, analysis and prioritizing the problem, then formulating the preliminary draft, sending the draft to the public discussion through media and other sources, and massive engagement of the people with the critical analysis of the all dimensions, and then based on that refining the policy document, and that document to keep public and parliamentarian and other stakeholders to get feedback from there and make sure that the national concerns are addressed in that particular public policy, and also internalized by all the key stakeholders, and then it can go to the cabinet committee to pass and implement. So without these steps, irrespective of what we do, it is not possible. Therefore, Policy Research Institute have developed 2 guidelines for the Nepal government, and hopefully they will utilize soon. One is the public policy formulation guidelines, and another is the public policy review guidelines. Without these 2 proper guided processes, the policy will not be effective, and therefore I emphasize that capacity to assess the global trend and the geostrategic dynamics, all that is one part. But even if they are there, if we are not following the proper processes, it will not work. And therefore, way forward for me is the state responsibility to develop the capacity, to develop the appropriate tools and techniques, and to respect the standard, international standard of the public policy formulation guidelines and its principle and practices. If we will do that, perhaps we can develop the better policy than what we are doing now. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Upreti. Professor Lohani, would you like to add upon what Dr. Upreti said, strictly in 2 minutes?
I don't have much to add, but the only thing, since I told you earlier, I was associated with the Nepal Council of Board, which is a non-governmental organization, and also I was associated with the Institute of Foreign Affairs, very much state-sponsored. So the difference between the 2 is there is acute resource constraint in the Nepal Council of World Affairs. You know, if we want to do research, it implies, it presupposes huge sums of money, you know, lot of resources in need, and we don't. And whatever we get from government is very paltry, very meager contribution, meager donation. That does not help us very much. So, and we have a hard time. But so far as Institute of Foreign Affairs is concerned, when I was just executive director, we decided to approach all security experts in 7 countries. Afghanistan was not yet a member at that time. So from Bangladesh to Sri Lanka, Maldives, all 7 experts on security were approached, and we, since we had some money at the disposal, the Institute of Foreign Affairs, we paid them handsomely. That meant, to be frank, each scholar, each expert got $500. You know, 20 years ago, $500 means much, quite a lot of money. So that way, we seven experts on security, they sent us their articles about Indian perspective on security, Bangladeshi perspective on security. So the title of the book is Security in South Asia. Really it's a good guidebook for scholars, university scholars, and even for policymakers. So resource constraint is the main problem. That's all I have to say.
Thank you, Professor Lohani. Thanks to all our great, wonderful panelists on touching, highlighting, underscoring the issues for making of Nepal's foreign policy with recent developments, both in bilateral and multilateral relations. I would like to thank Dr. Jaiswal and his team at NIICE, also to our NIICE presenters and panelists. Few things to take away from this discussion is, yes, all of you highlighted on complementarity between think tanks and media, then to validation, more research, and its reflection in media required, more dialogues and discussions, then national security and fact-based journalism, substantive information, more research to overcome, actually to overcome the echo chamber, the editorial biases at the newsroom, inviting same people time and again, and need to go beyond India and China-centric discussions. Equally important that you highlighted on the digital media literacy campaign, less inclination towards political or business powers, especially in the newsrooms. Also, as a chair, I would like to highlight that yes, media accountability is must. Media often talk about transparency and accountability, and media's role is to be accountable towards its readers, and that is high time for us to check whether we are accountable enough to what we write. That I think prepares all newsroom towards validation process. Also, yes, the highlights came across on orientation to public policy matters, finding out the resources and everything. These are some of the key takeaways from this panel discussion. I take this opportunity to thank our distinguished panelists and the organizers for having me as a chair. Thank you very much.